Welcome, everyone. Today, I am very pleased to welcome Michael David Wilson to the show. Now, I've been listening to Michael for about 10 years now from the This Is Horror podcast, but he's also released a few books in the last few years. Welcome, Michael. Do you mind introducing yourself a little bit too? I sort of a little bit introduced you.
Yeah, thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here. I am the author of a number of books, including The Girl in the Video, They're Watching with Bob Pastorella, and most recently, House of Bad Memories. And I am also the host of This Is Horror, the founder of This Is Horror, I should say. There's a podcast, a publishing arm, a website that has been going on since 2011, and the podcast itself has been going on since 2013. So we're now on year 11. We've interviewed a number of people, including Chuck Palahniuk, Dean Koontz, Josh Malerman, Charlene Harris. So fair few writers. And yeah, I'm delighted to be here with you, Jason.
Excellent. Now, having listened to your podcast over the years, you get to learn a little bit about the hosts, especially when it's long running like yours. Now, I'm certain that you've mentioned this, and I find it a very unique sort of thing that we both share in common, if I'm correct. But you were a fan of the Horror Etc. podcast?
That's right.
That
Yeah.
show
Like,
was awesome. Like,
yeah. Yeah, so you've been listening to podcasts for a very long time then, almost
yeah,
since the beginning, because there's not a lot of people who know about horror, etc. But whenever I'm talking about this as horror and I'm talking about the influences, I say it's kind of like I put horror, etc., the booked podcast, and the Geek's Guide to the Galaxy in this melting pot, stirred it all together, and this is horror podcast is what came out.
yeah, this is horror podcast. I don't remember when they started, but I was listening to them, I think around 2008, 2009, and then I listened all the way until they ended. Did you listen for a long period of time too?
Yeah, yeah, to horror, etc. Yeah, Dan Howarth, in fact, I think was one of the people who put me on to horror, etc. So he was an original co-host of the This Is Horror podcast, but they just had these really kind of deep dives. It was mostly movies, so that I
Yeah,
kind of wanted to go deeper, but then the literature end of things. But
yeah, me
it
too.
was so
They gave
fascinating, and I miss it. If it came back, I would listen to it.
Me too. Yeah, they did a lot of deep dives on directors. They treated directors like they would authors of books, and that's one thing I really enjoyed about it.
Yeah, yeah, and I believe one of the co-hosts is now like filmmaking or tangentially involved in films. I haven't
Yeah.
dug too deep into where are they now, but I think they're still doing at least horror tangential things.
Yeah, I remember the first time I heard you mention that, I was like, "Oh my god!" Like, that's awesome. Because, I don't think I've ever talked to anybody who's listened to that podcast, but it was pretty popular for its time.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, absolutely. It's one of the OG horror podcasts, I would say.
yeah. Oh, another thing I think we have in common. I'm not entirely sure, but I'm pretty sure that because Mastodon, the band, they appear in more than one of your books. So I'm wondering, are you a fan of heavy music?
I love heavy metal, yeah. And I clocked your t-shirt as soon as we got on the call
Yeah.
as well, yeah. So
I put this on for you, by the way,
yeah, yeah,
because
I'm a huge fan of heavy metal, particularly extreme metal, death metal, black metal, like, well, all the metal, to be honest.
yeah,
The only metal I don't listen to much, I suppose, is power metal and folk metal. But
yeah, you know what?
yeah,
Me too, honestly. I love a lot of
there you
different
go.
types, but the folk metal I just don't get. It's just I mean, it's fine if people like it, obviously, but it's just not it's not for me.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, people will notice there are a lot of music references in really all of my books and all of my
Yeah,
stories, and it's just adding like another dimension, another flavor to things. I mean, in House of Bad Memories, there's a reference to playing a band called A Pale Horse Named Death, which is quite an obscure band to mention. I mean,
Yeah.
people will know some of the former members from well, some of the current members, sorry, from Typo Negative, who were the
Mhm.
more popular band. But yeah, I just think it really helps capture a tone and a mood, really. So yeah, there's a lot of heavy metal
Yeah.
within my fiction.
Have you how long have you listened to, heavy metal?
I mean, I've been listening to heavy metal since I was a teenager. Yeah, so I mean, some of the bands that really initially got my attention were the likes of Motorhead and Megadeth.
Mhm.
I remember the Rust in Peace
That's a
album.
brilliant album right there.
Yeah, yeah. So
Yeah,
that's what started the love affair, I suppose, with heavy metal. And
yeah.
you know, when I, in terms of extreme metal, I, I actually I actually guess that Cradle of Filth were amongst the first. I think they're almost like a stepping stone to black metal. It's
Yeah, for
it's
sure.
almost, and then it's like you get into Dimmu Borgir, and it's like, oh, okay, now this is like Cradle of Filth on a whole other level. And then checking out things like At the Gates, of
Yeah.
course, Slaughter of the Soul, and Carcass, Heartwork, and
Mm. Getting in some, death metal there too, yeah.
oh, yeah, yeah. And I mean, I also like the really nihilistic stuff like Shining. I think that, is it the Swedish or the Norwegian one? The one that is dark as hell. And
Wow.
there,
That's the first band you've mentioned so far that I don't think I've heard of.
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, if you like just the blackest, the most bleakest, I think that they even as a subgenre, it's something like almost like suicidal black
Okay,
metal.
yeah.
Like
I've heard of that.
there's Shining and Forgotten Tomb is another one. So
Yeah.
one who ironically titled Life Lover. So there's they do not love life
Yeah.
from the lyrics. Yeah, I could talk about heavy metal all day. I don't know how
Yeah.
interesting that will be to your listeners and viewers, but
Yeah, well,
yeah.
it's quite the dark thing to be into when you're a kid, and yet a lot of kids are, right? Um, I know, from listening to podcasts and listening to you on your own podcast that your grandmother, she used to tell you, ghost stories, and I'm
That's
wondering if
right.
maybe this is, maybe where this fascination for, like, darker things came from.
Yeah, I mean, whenever people are asking me about my origin story as a writer, as a fan of horror, then one of the first experiences was my grandmother telling me these ghost stories that purported to be real life ghost stories. You know, depends on your belief on that one. And
Yeah.
she'd tell me that, you know, late at night before I went to bed, whenever I stayed over at her house. My parents weren't happy with that. They were like, "Stop telling
Like,
him
"What are you
these
doing?"
stories." But you know, in her defense, like I asked her to. It's like this is great. This is amazing. There was that kind of roller coaster excitement, I suppose, that interest in feeling a little bit scared. And it's like, yeah, this is good. This is
Mhm.
fun. And so yeah, she would tell me these stories. And you know, in terms of the writing, I think I've always been interested in telling stories, and on some level myself. I wonder if her telling those stories to me ignited me wanting to tell stories to other people. But my granddad, in fact, was the one who was really instrumental in and encouraging in terms of my writing. So I would present him with these stories and get him to read them, give me feedback on them. So between the two of them, they helped create the horror writer in me.
I think that's awesome. Like, I never had anything like that. For me, my own grandmother was a huge reader. She read a lot of books, but she only read like romance books. I didn't have anybody like telling me ghost stories. For me, it was like accidental uh, watching horror movies on TV that my parents
Yeah,
didn't know were horror movies. That was like my introduction to horror. But I think it's awesome that you had a grandmother who would sit you down and say, "Okay, Michael,
yeah,
I have something really, really kind of spooky to tell you." Um,
yeah,
and
yeah. And there's a rich history of kind of oral ghost storytelling within the UK. I mean, there's a lot of incredibly old buildings, so that there's
yeah.
things that are purported to have happened. And I mean, she had a lot of stories to tell me about York, which is a very historical city. I mean, it used to be the capital city of England, and that there's the dungeons in York. There are many so-called haunted pubs. I mean, if you visit York, there are multiple ghost tours that you can go on where you've got somebody just walking you around, showing you the buildings, telling you the history. And like it's just so fascinating for me, and like telling me these stories of like paintings where the figure in the painting, he appeared to move, telling me about this pub that had a basement and seeing these Roman soldiers walking through it, but their legs were kind of cut off because the street level was different back then. But it's just, yeah, it, whether you do or don't believe in it, and who is to say really, I just love the idea of, but what if? What if it is true?
Yeah. And can you remember where maybe that fascination for those ghost stories that your grandmother told you, do you remember when that transitioned to you wanting to tell your own stories?
I mean, I think that they both happened at quite a similar time. I mean, she was telling me these stories from a very young age, and I was writing and telling my own stories, from like 5 years old, really. I mean, I suppose at five, I couldn't write that that well, but certainly trying to construct a story. And I know in terms of the first things that I wrote, I was quite inspired by Roald Dahl and kind of, I suppose, weird fairy tales, and making bizarre versions of like Jack and the Beanstalk and things like that, like planting something in the garden and seeing what grows and
Yeah.
where it might lead you. And I mean, I always enjoyed the ghost train as well. Whenever like we're at some sort of fun fair or amusement park, and I was drawing pictures of monsters as well, like Frankenstein and Dracula and all of that. And I mean, later when I played the likes of Silent Hill and Resident Evil, it was like, well, I'm going to write kind of tributes to these, not quite fan fiction, but heavily inspired and ripped off versions, shall we say.
Yeah.
And yeah, I've always wanted to write, so I have always written. But I think one thing that I kind of came up against was actually through interviewing people for This Is Horror. I was interviewing like real heavyweights of supernatural horror fiction, like Ramsey Campbell and Adam Neville. I
Hmm.
have spoken about this briefly before, but there was a moment where I felt a little bit of panic, or that I'd kind of messed up for myself, because I thought, well, the type of fiction that they're writing is nothing like the fiction that I write.
Yeah.
Like I mean, I think there's an argument, particularly as I've written more books, that what I'm writing, I'm not sure if it even is horror. I think it's horror tangential. It's dark fiction,
Mhm.
but kind of part of my personality and my interest is humor and these just weird situations. And
Mhm.
I was worried that people are never gonna take this seriously if what I'm doing is more kind of akin to the mighty Boosh, I suppose, but I'm interviewing people like Ramsey Campbell.
Yeah.
But, luckily when I released my fiction into the world, it's like, well, no, first of all, people can separate what I'm doing with This Is Horror and what I'm doing with Michael David Wilson fiction. And also, as we know from the likes of Danger Slater and Carlton Mellick, and even the British kind of dark thriller writer John Niven, there's such a gamut, a range of horror and dark fiction anyway. So
Yeah. Well, y you're obviously, you would know best, it's your fiction, but I've thought about this myself when reading your work. Your work tends to be sort of horror adjacent, but there is horror elements. You always add the horror elements, and it makes me think, honestly, of, horror fiction, maybe pre-Stephen King, because, that's the way horror kinda was in the '60s and '70s. You'd have stories that are deeply rooted in reality. Sometimes they'd be funny, sometimes they'd be not. That's not where I'm going with this, but the idea is that it's rooted in mundane reality, no matter the circumstances, and then the horror kinda comes near the end.
yeah, I mean, I've always been interested in dark fiction, and I've also always been interested in humor, particularly if it's dark humor.
Mhm.
And I struggle these days. I suppose since I found my voice and I got an idea as to what the type of writing is that I do, I it is very difficult for me to write a straight horror without some humor
Yeah.
creeping into it. It is equally very difficult for me to write a humorous piece without it getting a little bit messed up and a little bit
Yeah.
horror adjacent. So rather than fighting that, I just do whatever whatever kind of the story wants. And I think if you're doing what's authentic and what the story requires, then it's going to be a much better experience for both you as a writer and then for the reader. So probably the biggest struggle is then selling it and categorizing it. And it's like, what
Mhm.
what genre do you even put this in, or how do
Yeah.
you pitch it to an agent, to a publisher? I mean, it's not always an easy sell, but I think it's something original. I mean, I've had comparisons to it almost at times being the fiction equivalent to Guy Ritchie or to Quentin Tarantino. And
Mhm.
of course, as with everyone, opinion is divided on them. But for me, that's a huge compliment because I love what both of them are doing.
Absolutely. While I was, devouring House of Bad Memories, I thought Quentin
Mm.
Tarantino, that thought came into my head, and then again, when I was, reading, They're Watching, there's just that element in the, dialogue of how the, characters pick at each other.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, I think it's fair to categorize my fiction as dialogue heavy, and
Yeah.
I do enjoy those kind of longer conversations. But as with all good storytelling, you have to make sure that there's a purpose, that you're progressing the plot, that there's something in there, and we're learning something. And yeah, it's like it's all a puzzle, fiction writing, putting it all together. And yeah, there's some interesting side routes with like people like Annabelle Young as we progress the story.
Yeah. Now, we're here to talk about House of Bad Memories, and I got myself a copy of the physical book, but I want to
Yeah.
thank you for getting me the audiobook. The audiobook is absolutely fantastic. Um, so thanks for the code for that, but it's narrated by Aubrey Parsons.
Yes.
And from
Yeah.
my understanding, you retained the rights to do the
That's right.
audiobook yourself. How how did you find the narrator, or did you have Aubrey in mind in the first place?
So, I mean, with the previous two books, I've used R.J. Bailey, who is a fantastic audiobook narrator. But for House of Bad Memories, this is very specifically rooted in the Midlands. And so that wasn't an accent that RJ felt was kind of something that he excels at. He was also very busy anyway, rightly so, because as I said, he's fantastic. So
Hmm. Yeah,
I
he's
was then
really good too.
looking, oh, yeah, yeah. So I was then looking for another way to get the book out. I had some conversations with some audiobook publishers, but they ultimately didn't work out. So then it's like, right, I'm just going to independently put this out as I did with the girl in the video, as I did with their watching. And so then came the daunting task of looking for a narrator. But
Hmm.
actually, it became quite an easy task because I had a conversation with friend and fellow author David Moody, and he told me that he now has Aubrey as his go to narrator,
Hmm.
and the range of accents that Aubrey can do is remarkable. So he told me to check him out, see what I think. And I mean, I was fairly impressed that a man from Wales could open one of David's books very convincingly as a woman from Leeds.
Yeah.
That was a fairly impressive trick. I listened to some of his other samples, and I mean, the range is so vast that you think, hang on, is this the same guy? But it is the same guy as far as I know. I did interview him, and he did some accents live to
Wow.
prove he's not multiple people. And so we got in touch, we had a conversation. He did an audition. I was impressed. And there you go, working with Aubrey Parsons. And as anyone who has worked with me on a creative project will know, I can be quite pedantic. I can be quite meticulous with revisions and notes. And he was receptive to them for the
Hmm.
most part. You know, sometimes it was like, okay, Michael, let's just calm down. Please accept this take.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
you know, I think the first time that you work with a new person, you're both trying to get a sense of each other's working methods and rhythm. So in a way, the first project is almost the most difficult. And then when you understand what it's like, then going forward, it's a lot easier. But I mean, yeah, generally it was a very easy and joyful process working with Aubrey. Like the hardest part will probably be for him having to work with me and my bloody pedantic notes. But in terms of him, he was great. And yeah, the accents he did, particularly for Jade, one of my favorite
Yeah,
characters. And based on reviews, it seems to be a favorite character of many people. I thought he got it absolutely spot on.
he did. He blew it out of the park. It's one of the best narrated books I think I've ever listened to be quite honest with you. And I listen to a lot of audiobooks. I don't know how many I have. I have like over 500 in my library, and I probably listened to like a good three quarters of them. So uh, it's
Yeah.
incredible,
Oh,
how good he was.
I'll let him know that. And I mean, what one thing I did wonder, because this is so set in the Midlands, so there's probably almost in the way some of the accents are a bit of a Peaky Blinders flavor to it. But I did wonder, what will this be like for Americans and for Canadians and for, well, for rather than list every nationality for everyone who isn't from the UK
Yeah.
listening to it, because yeah, like with RJ Bailey, it was quite a neutral narration, but that there was no neutrality, as it were. It was very much the Midlands that House of Bad Memories was set in. So I'm glad that that worked out for you, and it was,
Yeah.
you yeah.
I had absolutely no issues, really. I mean, I'm sure there's some, like, some of the humor and whatnot, and some of the, distinct, parts of the, accents might have gone over my head here and there, but I don't remember it. But I do consume a lot of British, things, so, like, TV and whatnot, so I'm fairly used to the, accents myself. Um, but yeah, I loved it, and, I also wanted to talk a little bit about, the cover art, because I've
Oh
never heard you
yeah.
talk about the cover art, but that's fantastic cover art. Can you, tell me a little bit about the process of, who did it, and maybe how meticulous you were on getting it?
Yeah, so this is from Vincent Young. And so before Vincent, I had worked with Pai Pa on both The Girl in the Video and They're Watching, and many This Is Horror, chapbook, and novella covers, including A House at the Bottom of a Lake by Josh Malaman, Water for
Mhm,
Drowning by Ray Cluley. So Pai was very much my go-to cover artist. But actually, I suppose much like RJ Bailey, Pi was absolutely rammed in terms of his schedule. So there just wasn't capacity to work with him. And one of my favorite artists of all time is Vincent Young. He's done covers for the likes of Stephen King and Joe Hill
mhm.
and China Mieville. And I thought, well, let's see if he wants to add Michael David Wilson to that list. So I sent him a message. I mean, we had spoken beforehand about various things, and he won a This Is Horror Award quite a while ago, maybe 2000 and yeah, could have been the first one. I think that might be 2011. So it was going way back. But you know, cover art I take very seriously,
Mhm.
and it's like, well, if my go-to cover artist isn't available, why don't I contact basically the person I consider to be the greatest cover artist of all time? You know, why not
Yeah.
shoot for number one? And he was really interested. So then we discussed like our vision and what we might do. Now, somehow, and I do not think this is typical at all for cover artists, but every time Pai Pa would do a cover for me, he would read the book before doing the cover art.
Hmm.
And somehow Vincent Young also did that. So I was pretty surprised that somebody who's done cover art for Stephen King is like, let me read your book before I do this.
Yeah.
So he did. Then we discussed what it might look like. And I said I would love to have a load of Easter eggs and references in the cover art that people will only get after they have read the book.
Mhm.
And actually, we are going to be announcing a competition very soon to win various prizes, including a print of the cover art signed
Mm.
by Vincent Young, including like signed copies of my books. So various little goodies. And the way that you enter this niche competition is you send in all the references on the cover that you can spot, and the person who gets the most references wins.
That's pretty
So
awesome.
there are so many references on that cover, and I could not have been happier. I
That's
mean,
incredible. I mean, that's probably how he got to be so, so well loved, and how he got like people like Stephen King.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I specifically asked him to put these Easter
Oh,
eggs in.
okay.
So I'm not sure if Stephen King is like throw as many references as you can,
Yeah.
but he said that he tries to do things like that anyway. I think we just went very overboard in the best possible way. So now you're probably looking at the cover and like,
I
right,
am.
have you
I'm
got
like,
any can I spot?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. Now, House of Bad Memories, I found it has a great dedication. It really shows exactly what this book is about, or at least the emotional punches that the reader can expect. Do you mind if I read it out?
of course. Yeah, go for it.
It says, "This is a novel of love and hate, betrayal and forgiveness, revenge and redemption. This is dedicated to all human beings. Flawed and frayed, I see perfection in your imperfections." And that's that sums up pretty much the emotions that you feel throughout the
Yeah.
whole thing. Did you write that dedication before or after? I imagine it had to have come after some point.
Yeah, I believe it came after, yeah.
Now, one thing that kept me like I devoured this book really quickly, and one reason why is because of how you're able to continuously escalate the tension. Um, so I'm wondering how exactly, like, it just builds and builds and builds until it explodes. And I was like mesmerized by this, like making me think of like Blake Crouch a little bit here. Like once
Mm.
it gets going, it's just like it's like a book on cocaine almost. So how were you able to achieve that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I mean, I suppose I'll talk a little bit about specifics with House, but then also more generally. I mean, typically when I start off writing a story, there will be a plan of sorts, but I mean, I'll certainly know how it's starting, the journey that we need to go on to a point in the
Hmm.
middle, and then also how it's going to end. And I do try to have like something along the lines of chapter by chapter, but there's always that possibility to change and to alter it. So it is very much malleable. And I mean, of course, you do need to escalate to get from each point. And, if you have the absolute craziest point be in the middle, then there's an argument as to where do you go from there. Although some people would argue, perhaps not incorrectly, that at about the 60% mark there is a chapter in House of Bad Memories that is the peak and is the what the hell just happened. But I think and I hope that in spite of going there, we then took it further in some other ways later on after that point. But
Yeah.
I mean, with House of Bad Memories, it's an interesting one because actually it started off as a novella
Hmm.
and it was going to be published by another publisher, but for various reasons we decided, okay, we weren't going to work together, and it was an amicable decision. So like there's nothing wrong with that publisher.
Hmm.
Actually, to be honest, it comes back to me being very pedantic. There was something very specific that I wanted in terms of the presentation, and they didn't want to do that. And it's like, well, can we just not go forward then?
Yeah. Okay.
And to give a sense as to my pedantry, probably 80 or 90% of the people wouldn't even notice the thing that I wanted. But I'm very particular.
Yeah.
So then when I got the rights back, I thought, well, what do I want to do with this? And at that point as well, I had, and I still do have a film manager who, Ryan Lewis, he's also the film manager of Josh Malaman, and he
Mm.
kind of shops the rights or looks at, is there possibility to turn my fiction into a film? And he said with the original House of Bad Memories that he really liked it, but he wasn't sure exactly how he was going to sell it. It wasn't immediately clear, like what's the hook, what's the pitch, because it was quite an understated British thriller at that point.
Yeah.
And then I thought, well, what if where it ends is just a halfway point?
Hmm.
And what if we can escalate it into a way that would make it more cinematic and, and kind of wild? And so I sat with that idea. And then I suppose I transformed it from a first half that is more like This Is England to a second half that almost has like elements of Old Boy and I Spit on Your Grave,
Hmm.
all wrapped in this kind of British Guy Ritchie Tarantino-y,
Tarantino-y.
yeah, Tarantino-y kind of wrapping paper.
Yeah.
And when I planned out and realized what was going to happen in the second half, I thought I have simultaneously made this easier and harder to sell as a film, because
Hmm.
the aforementioned scene that I referenced before, I don't see anyone making a faithful rendition of that and
Yeah.
putting it in their local commercial cinema.
There might be a couple of parts, actually.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I mean it certainly made it more actiony at times, but yeah, it was simultaneously more and absolutely less commercial. So I probably made it harder to sell as a film actually when I rewrote it and expanded it and doubled the story. But at that point I was already in love with it.
Yeah.
And so it is what it is. And honestly, particularly with with nearly every story from House of Bad Memories and that I've written after, they start off as if there might be something a bit commercial, and then it goes into the just the kind of wildest that is what are you doing? But it's just the way that my brain works. But anytime I put something weird in, I do think of story. I do think of, okay, but how is this cohesive? So it can't be gratuitous. If
Hmm.
you're going to throw something weird in, it has to serve the story. And that's kind of the principle that governs all of my writing. Is this serving the story? If it's not, then it has to go.
Hmm.
And at the moment, so since House of Bad Memories, I have written another two novels that are with my film manager and with beta readers at the moment. And now as they're doing the kind of beta reader circuit, I've returned to a novel that I started, I don't know, a year or so ago, and it it is 60,000 words of absolute disarray, and I am going through it now and just cutting anything where it's like, no, this is not serving the story. So as wild as people might think some of the fiction is, as tangential as some of the people might think the conversations are. It's like, no, this is the polished and edited version. You should see what I had to cut.
The stuff I cut out. Woo!
Yeah.
One thing I because you did write this in base uh, in two separate time periods. I think it was the Arc podcast. I heard you describe this book as like the first half is like about childhood trauma, and the
Yeah.
second half is about adulthood trauma.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm interested in both parts because you said something else interesting in that podcast. You said that in 2018 you were sitting down to write the first half of this, the childhood trauma part, and you said that you had a lot of anger in your heart when you wrote it. But then when you were done, the whole book, the bitterness and the anger that you felt towards those bad things that happened in your life, you felt like those had lifted. Do you think that writing this book helped you exercise those demons?
So I think partially, yeah. I think there was something cathartic and something helpful in the writing for me personally. But yeah, you're right that I wrote this book in two very distinct periods of my life. So
Mm-hmm.
the first one I wrote when I was a new father, so experiencing being a father for the first time, and also reflecting on my own childhood and, you know, perhaps parts that were not ideal.
Mm-hmm.
And so that very much went into the first half. But then by the time I was writing the second half, a number of years later, I had just split up with, my wife at the time, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
And like I was dealing with a lot towards that. And then there was a custody battle, as there often is. And I mean, I've said before that I think that 2021 and 2022 were unquestionably the worst times of my adult life.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I'm kind of writing and revising parts of it during that period. But of course, I mean, while I'm redrafting things, like I mean that the first half was very much redrafted and re-edited during that period as well. Like everything has to be cohesive. It's not like I wrote this original novella and then it's like, right, well, that's set in stone. No,
Yeah.
like so much was changed and then was foreshadowed because there was a whole other element to the story that came in that I had to foreshadow from the start.
Mm-hmm.
But to go back to your original question, so yeah, the writing was cathartic and helped process some of the pain from my childhood, but actually the the adult trauma, for want of better terminology, when that happened, I'm trying to think exactly how to phrase this. 'Cause I want to say it put in. I was going to say it put in perspective the childhood trauma, but no, the childhood trauma was not good. But I think as well, it's like I say in the dedication, like I believe, a great number of people, if they show sincerity, then redemption should be possible. If
Mm-hmm.
they show sincerity is the key term there. Also, because I mean, this is something that is discussed and unfortunately comes up a lot. The only person who can really forgive is the person who was the victim to begin with.
Mhm.
So, but yeah, like just the things that were happening in my adulthood made me forgive some of the things that had happened in my childhood. And I think I just didn't want to carry a lot of pain, and I didn't want to obsess over the past and let that hold back my present and my future. And I'm probably talking in inexact and murky terms because it's almost difficult for me to get back into what exactly was that mindset. But what I can tell you is when I was writing the first half, I was consumed with anger and negativity towards things that had happened in my childhood. And now I feel it's like it's lifted.
Mhm.
I just feel peace. There's no ill will. There's
Yeah.
nothing negative. It's gone. And actually it's interesting to be talking now in 2024. I haven't like this is even harder to articulate, and I'm trying to think what do I even feel at the moment. But as hard as 2021 and 2022 were, 2023 and 2024 have been so much better. And I'm trying not to hold on to any negativity for any of the, so-called trauma, if we're to use that blanket term,
Yeah.
or negativity, let's say, that happened in 21 and 22. I'm trying not to hold on to that.
Well, that's
I,
that's what forgiveness is for, really. It's not for the person who hurt you. It's for yourself. Because to
yeah,
forgive is to let go.
yeah. So right now, I'm in a really good place.
That's good. That's good to
Yeah,
hear.
yeah.
Um, to go back into the pain a little bit more, though,
Oh yeah.
um, I wanted to say that you write about betrayal really well. I felt Danny's pain like a punch in the gut during the second half, and I'm talking about that scene in the car with Denny, Cat, and the thugs, Slaughter and Butcher and Maniac.
Oh
That's a
yeah.
that is an intense scene. I don't want to give too much away though, but I'm assuming that that betrayal is like what happens and what's said in that scene in the car is the genesis for the adult trauma in your real life.
Well, I don't know what I can say exactly
You
about
don't
that.
need to go into like what happened to you. I'm not that's not what I'm expecting. What I'm saying is like um typically when people put something of their real life into fiction, it looks nothing like what happened in real life. But the pain that you feel in there, you can tell that you were betrayed, I think, in one way or another. And that's what I felt because I've been there too.
Yeah, I mean there were real emotions that went into this book, and authentic emotions. And so I'm glad that that was. I was gonna say I'm glad that you felt it too. I obviously am not glad that something akin happened in your own life, but I'm glad that what I was trying to, I suppose, have the reader feel work, that it was authentic, that yeah, you felt those emotions. I mean that's kind of
Yeah, it's
our
very
job
authentic.
as a
Yeah.
writer.
Yeah. It's very authentic. Now, I wanted to talk about the characters because the characters they come alive in this book. Um, I love the characters because they're all different shades of gray too. They're not either good guys or bad guys. They're human. They have their flaws. I was wondering, how do you approach creating characters that feel like real people?
I mean, I think that's another good question, and sometimes it's difficult to answer things like this, because so much of what is done is organic rather than like meticulously approaching it and
Yeah.
having a set method. But I think if you think about people, you know, if you think about any human, we're all painted in shades of gray. So just making sure that whatever character you're creating has that to them. And I mean, particularly with Butcher and Slaughter, to begin with, you could think they're almost just like archetypal heavies, and they're like the generic muscle, like
Yeah.
default bad guy, but then throwing in some backstory and some motive as to, what, why is Slaughter actually doing this?
Hmm.
And then it's like, okay, there's a little bit more nuance to him. And I just think it's like trying to write characters as you would accurately describe another person if you were being 100% truthful about them. And I think even the people who we hold in the highest esteem, even the best people, they have their flaws, they have their
Hmm.
weaknesses. And even the most despicable, evil people, there will be something that is not exactly relatable, but something that in a different context and with a different person, it's like, okay, well, there's a good thing, the joke or the thing that a lot of people say is like, even Hitler liked dogs.
Yeah. Well, you kind of do that in here because you
Yeah,
have you have some characters that on the surface they look like they're the bad guy and they're only bad guys. Um, I would take away Maniac from that because we don't really get to know Maniac too much, but his name is just he's a
yeah,
total maniac. But I'm thinking more of like Frank and Slaughter, I guess, because we get like Frank, we see through the eyes of other characters that he wasn't always the man that he was to Denny.
yeah,
That he had a caring side, like when we see Frank through the eyes of Jade, and also Slaughter. There's parts where he's torturing a character, and they're like, Why are you doing?" You can tell, I can tell you don't want to do this, and he's like, "You know what? I really don't want to do this, but I have to. So let's get to it." So
yeah,
there's like layers to the characters, and I think you show these layers through the dialogue, and I think that's one reason why people say that you're really and you are really good at dialogue.
yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for that. And I mean, yeah, like the idea was again to paint this realistically, which for some people, given some of the scenes, may sound an actual ridiculous statement to make, but I mean realistic in terms of these characters as humans. And I do think that the good characters do bad things at points, the bad characters, yeah, as you say, maybe apart from Maniac. I mean, even Maniac, he has loyalty to his
Yeah,
gang.
yeah.
I
True
suppose
enough.
that's a good thing.
He has loyalty, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe there'll be a kind of spin-off where we get to see Maniac. I don't think he could be the main character, though. That would
It would
be
have to be in a
far
prequel
too
sort of
intense.
setting, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Although in terms of spin-offs, I've thought it would be wonderful at some point to write something entirely from the perspective of Jade, but
Yes.
again would be very
Well
intense to do. But I
well
mean, the current novel that I'm working on. So wrote I wrote the current novel that I've returned to at a similar period in my life as to when I revised the second half of House of Bad Memories. And I'm going back to it now, and I was so angry, and I've put so much anger into that. But the issue that I have at the moment that I'm dealing with it's in the first person present tense, which is not something I normally do. Now I quite often do the first person, but not in the present.
Yeah.
And this character, he's so full of hate and anger, but he's he's trying to be a good person, but he's too much of an asshole. But he's not gone to the level of, say, Bret Easton Ellis in American Psycho,
Okay.
or Bret Easton Ellis's character, not
Mm.
specifically
Yeah.
him. This isn't a slight against Bret, but I feel as I'm kind of rereading it and reworking it that I have to either double down and make this protagonist totally irredeemable, or I have to rein it back in, because at
Mhm.
the moment it's like he is an asshole, but he's not quite gone far enough. So it's just going like readers will hate him, but without having glee in it. And I think that is sometimes the writer's dilemma. And it's like, if you're going to go far, go kind of chapter 22 in House of Bad Memories far.
Yeah. Chapter
All the
22.
way. Yeah.
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 That involves some certain substance.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's 22. It might be 23 anyway. We know the
I,
chapter I'm talking
I'm
about.
pretty sure I know that chapter. Yeah.
Yeah, you do.
It was one of the nasty things that I don't think you could really.
Put on film.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. The Ark Party with Rob Olsen know that chapter. The podcast that you referenced before.
Yeah. I also want to talk about the two main characters. I think we'll start with Jade because this is a fan favorite. She was a favorite of mine too, but I'm not too sure I'd want her as a sister, maybe because of what there's a couple of things she does in this book that would have me having panic attacks. um,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't think anybody who reads this is meant to go away with the feeling that they would like Jade to be their sister. If, I don't know what to say if you do. I mean,
well,
maybe makes me wonder, what is your current sister like?
I would,
If you
I would want her on my side
yeah.
if it came to it, but
Oh yeah.
because
Yeah,
she'd
you
go
don't
to
want to
them.
make an enemy of her,
No.
but you don't need to go as far as to wish, oh, if only that was my sister.
Yeah. She makes some really interesting choices, and I think that's the like what I loved about her is that she believes the first thing that comes into her head, and like the first thought she has, that's the fact, and she's going after it, and because of that, she makes some bad decisions, but she does these bad things out of the most like love and deep loyalty to her family.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, she's incredibly loyal to her family. She's very protective of her children.
Hmm.
And I mean, I think that Jade is absolutely trying her best. And I think, in her heart, at her core, she is a good person, but she's very impulsive. It's
Hmm.
like she will think something, she will act on it, she will say it, she will do it, and she will make spur of the moment decisions.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, we hint at her backstory as well, and
Yeah.
where is this coming from, and how has Jade become Jade? That so I think a prequel almost with the Jade origin story could be interesting for people. How does a human
Mhm.
become Jade?
Yeah. Is that something you're actually considering of writing about?
I mean, if there was enough demand, then it is something that I would do. I think at the moment, I mean, all three of my books that I've released, they've been standalones. The other two that I'm hoping to release fairly soon, they're standalones as well. But if you read enough of my fiction, even though they're standalones, I sometimes put little references, very subtle references. So it might be a little bit pretentious, really, but I enjoy it so that it's as if they all happened in the same universe. So something happened in their watching that's almost now canon. That has happened within the world,
Yeah.
so they could reference that in House of Bad Memories because it was a real life event that happened.
Yeah. I think it would be awesome. You could even not do you could do a prequel, you could do something in the future. Uh, I could see because of Jade's beliefs and the way she thinks about things, it would be interesting to see her go on off on her own little adventure with maybe some supernatural elements near the end coming to fruition, because she believes in that kind of stuff as well, right?
Yeah,
Yeah. I
yeah,
also like Denny. He's a really interesting protagonist, I felt, because he loves his family, especially his daughter May, and he just wants to live life peacefully as possible without any drama. And yet, he's also very deceptive, and he's exceptionally good at keeping secrets. I mean, he's exceptionally good at keeping
yeah,
secrets.
yeah, yeah,
Uh, I don't know, like Denny. I think he's a really interesting protagonist because there's times when you're like, man, this guy's kind of slimy. Like, like at first, when you first meet him, you think he's the greatest guy, but you learn things about him as the story goes on.
yeah, yeah. And I mean, based on reader feedback and comment, there do seem to be commonalities to a point in terms of that perception of Brian in their watching, apart
Yeah.
from a lot earlier on, people think, okay, Brian has some issues.
Yeah.
It's not as guarded as with Danny. And I think a theme throughout though is that every character is trying to do their best.
Hmm.
That genuinely everything that they're doing it because they think it is the right thing to do.
Hmm. But it is human. It's human to err.
Oh yeah, and
Yeah.
and air they all do.
Yeah.
There's a lot of airing in
There's a
this
lot
book.
of erring. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. A
Nobody's
book of
innocent in this
airing.
world. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Well, I absolutely loved House of Bad Memories, and I want to
Thank
thank you
you.
for turning me on to this wonderful book. And I'm not just blowing smoke up your ass here. I mean it. Like it might make it's going to make. I'm pretty sure the top 10, which is a pretty pretentious thing of me to say as well, but it's going to make my top 10 at the end of the year. I'm quite certain. Um, but I also wanted, before we go, I also wanted to talk about a couple more things. I want to talk about They're Watching, which you mentioned in the answering the last question about Denny. You wrote this with your co-host Bob Pastorella. Um, Now I'm wondering, because you guys were podcasting for quite a while before you wrote a book together. I think you might have written a short story together before that, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right?
You are mistaken,
Okay.
unfortunately.
Okay.
We didn't, but I won't hold that against you.
Okay. I don't know where I got that from, but I was pretty certain about that. But what I was getting to was it inevitable, do you think, that you two would write a book together?
I don't know if it was inevitable. I mean,
You get two
what
writers on a podcast.
what in life really is inevitable?
True enough.
I mean, I take I take every question very seriously. So it's like, was it inevitable?
Was it?
I mean, in terms of how everything with Bob came about, I mean, if we go right the way back to the start, the way that I even became familiar with Bob Pastorella was because I read the Booked podcast anthology, and Bob Pastorella had a story in that. Now, I don't know how much you know about Booked podcast, but the host of Booked podcast was Rob Olson, who's
Yeah,
the
from
Art
the
Party.
art pod,
So,
yeah.
like, it's funny how everything we're talking about is almost quite circular, and perhaps if one were to believe in inevitability, that you know, everything seems to be coming together. But Bob's story was in my top 3 of that anthology,
Mhm,
and after reading it, I thought, I want to chat with Bob. I want to get to know more about Bob. So I invited him onto This Is Horror podcast. We got on incredibly well.
mhm,
It must have been only a matter of months later that, like, Dan Howarth was having to step away from the This Is Horror podcast for a bit because he had just become a father.
mhm,
So, understandably, decided that actually being a good dad was more important than hosting a podcast with me.
mhm.
That's, you know, what he decided was his priority. He probably made the right decision there. And so then, I mean, I did a number of solo interviews. I still do a number of solo interviews on This Is Horror,
Mhm,
but I brought in Bob Pastorella as a guest co-host. I think possibly the first episode was with Max Booth the third.
mhm.
Haven't interviewed the second or first, but that that went really well. And then I got Bob back on for some other podcasts, and before you knew it, really, he became the permanent co-host. He graduated from temporary to permanent,
Yeah.
and of course, we are both writers. And is this something about the way that Bob and I work together as podcasters? Now, I'm also missing out a step that he took over the This Is Horror podcast, not This Is Horror podcast, the This Is Horror website, sorry, as the manager of the website. Because I mean, understandably, I can't podcast, publish, edit,
Yeah,
write, manage the website, and hold down a full-time job without something seriously giving.
absolutely. Uh,
So Bob took over the website. So the combination of how he was running the website, how we were podcasting together, how we had and we still have a great friendship. I obviously it turned to, what would it be like if we collaborated on a story together?
mhm,
And as I remember it, I had like some ideas as to what the They're Watching story could look like, with the voyeurism, with the Adrian Lynn kind of influences. And I pitched that idea to Bob, and he seemed to think, okay, there's something to this. And then
mhm,
that was the one that we decided to work on together. And I mean, the way that the actual creative process worked was, so we planned it out chapter by chapter, which I kind of do anyway, as I said before. But I think if you're working with a co-writer, it's even more important. It's
mhm.
going to be absolute chaos if you haven't planned that out.
Yeah.
So we went through a number of drafts of even the plan, and then when we had a working plan, we started writing it. And actually, because I'm based in Japan and because he's based in Texas, it worked out really well in terms of like we could both get up and then there's like a story to continue because he's writing while I'm sleeping and vice versa.
Yeah.
Um, but some writers, they'll have a kind of, right, you take this chapter, I'll take this one, or you take this character, I'll take that character. But with me and Bob, we've got the plan and we write for as long as we happen to write in that session. So then when we stop, we send it back, and it could be a page, it could be 10 pages. It is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if I get it from Bob and the same if he gets it from me, before I write a new word, I go over everything he's written. As we know, I'm pedantic and I'm meticulous. So I do that. I add in my bits. We've got track changes on so we can see what's going on. And then we repeat this method. And so sometimes people say to us, it's difficult to see what was it that Bob wrote and what was it that I wrote.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, the reason is because we kind of both wrote every page. By the time we've deleted and we've added things, it's like who wrote
Yeah.
what?
That was actually
Every
one of my questions
yeah,
because you can't really tell. You can't pick either or voice out. It almost has its own voice.
yeah, which is good, which is what we wanted because I don't, it'd be too jarring if it's obvious who did what.
Yeah.
But one thing, I mean, we know if our memory is good enough, we sometimes know who started what section or who introduced a certain element. So something a number of people assume incorrectly is they assume that Bob introduced or primarily wrote or conceived of the PI character Ted. But
Mm-hmm.
actually that was me.
Oh yeah.
But it's like any live reading that we do, Bob is Ted, and that is the correct decision. I mean, if you look at Ted and you look at Brian, Bob has a very authoritative, booming Texan voice. He's perfect for Ted.
Yeah.
I can be the more neurotic, wimpy Brian. I can do that much better. It would be, yeah, it would be a bad casting decision to have me
Yeah.
as the PI and Bob as Brian. So yeah, there's kind of an awareness as to as to
I,
who
I
we are better to play.
I have to say that I loved the character of Ted because I don't think I've come across a PI like that in a long time.
Yeah.
He was willing to basically break the law in order to get the case done and to protect people.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, he's definitely a throwback.
Yeah, he's
You
definitely
couldn't do that in 2024 and keep your job.
yeah,
For sure.
exactly. Right. It's like all you have to do is report this guy and his goodbye PI status.
Yeah. Oh
So
yeah.
are there any plans for you and Bob to write together again?
So it's definitely a possibility. So actually, Bob and I, since then, we have collaborated on the screenplay version of Their
Mhm.
Watching. We've written and gone through a number of drafts of the screenplay. So I mentioned before having a film manager, and I thought since I got a film manager, and he said if I ever wanted to try to write a script, he would be willing to coach me through that process. And initially I thought, well, I'm more of a fiction writer. That's what I do.
Mhm.
But particularly, I suppose, because of my dialogue, I kept getting comments as to like, oh, I reckon if you did scripts, you'd be pretty good at it. And then just one day I thought, yeah, what I have this guy who said, if you want to learn how to write a script, to screenwrite, I will coach you. Why would I not take that opportunity?
Mhm.
Why don't I find out if it's something I'm good at? I can write a script, and if it was a bad experience, then it was a bad experience and it's done. But when people are on their deathbeds, they say that they regret the things that they didn't do. They regret the shots that they didn't take. They don't
Yeah.
say, "Oh, I wrote a script and I wasted 3 months of my life and I really regret that." That's not what they say.
Yeah, exactly.
So I was looking at the stories that I have, and I thought, actually, They're Watching is the one that makes the most sense to write as a script. And initially, I thought, oh, Bob isn't, Bob's got a lot on. He's not going to want to do this. So maybe I'll just, and like, I didn't want to put work on Bob, which if
Mhm.
Bob's listening, he might find hard to believe. He's like, what are you talking about? You always put bloody work on me. Well, on that occasion, I thought, oh, I don't want to do that. Maybe I was, for once, feeling generous or kind hearted. But anyway, I mentioned it to Bob, and I was like, "Look, don't worry about it. I'll do this script. Obviously, if it sells and we make money, you're getting money too." And he's like, What are you talking about? You're going to do this solo?" One of his ambitions had been to get into screenwriting, I find out, and it's like, okay, well,
Let's do this thing.
band are back together again. So
Yeah.
yeah, we wrote that. We went through many iterations. Luckily, according to my film manager, getting better every time, which is certainly the pattern that you would want.
Yeah.
And then after a number of drafts, my manager, he liked it, but he felt like that there's still something missing, but he can't say exactly what it is. So his advice was that me and Bob, we both work on a different screenplay independently, like a solo album, as it were. And then once we've done that, we come back together. So at the moment, like I've written this other screenplay. There's been some very positive comment on it, and like we're just waiting to see what happens next. So there's the potential that once that screenplay is further along, then maybe me and Bob will come back to They're Watching. But in terms of other novels and other projects where me and Bob are working together, there's no there's no official plan, but we certainly work well together. So it is a possibility for sure. I mean, I had come to Bob with They're Watching, and then he did come to me with another idea. So and we were talking about it at kind of the early stages and what it might look like, but for one reason or another, mostly being it's incredibly personal to Bob, we decided that it was actually better for Bob to work on that one as a solo project for him.
Mhm.
But I think there's a possibility that we will work together in the future, but it needs to be the right project. It needs to be something where it will be better because of the two of you working together. So it's just finding out what is that. So
Mhm.
what's this space?
It sounds to me like, writing a screenplay and getting it right to where people are gonna wanna pick it up and option it is a lot more difficult than writing a novel. Is that even close to accurate?
Yeah, I think that's really close to accurate. I mean, because if I write a novel and I can't land it with a publisher, or for whatever reason I don't find a publisher that I think is a good fit, I can independently publish that.
Mhm.
Independently publish it the right way, get the editor in, get the good cover art, do it properly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So any story that I write, as a novel or a novella, I can get out into the world. I can get readers for that. It can be available to buy.
Mm-hmm.
But if I write a script and no one wants to buy it, then
It's
it's
dead.
just sitting on my yeah, it's just sitting on my hard drive.
Yeah.
Well, well, actually, the way that I don't like wasting my time, and I don't like writing things that are not going to see the light of day.
Mm-hmm.
So the way that I have dealt with this is either I am adapting stories into screenplays that I already wrote. So they've already got an audience. Or if I were to write an original, then after I have written the screenplay, I will write the novelization of that.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, the screenplay that I'm working on at the moment, one of the first stories where I felt I found my voice, and this was before the girl in the video, was a short story called What Would Wesley Do? And that is available actually on the No Sleep podcast. It's
Mm-hmm.
behind a paywall, but it's not a very expensive paywall. And I do consider it probably the best short story that I wrote.
Mm-hmm.
And so then when my film manager Ryan said, "Why don't you work on a solo screenplay?" I decided that short story was the one to adapt and to expand into a full length film. So quite a different approach to their watching, because with their watching, with it being a novel, it's like, right, what can we include and what do we have to cut out?
Yeah.
And then with it being a short story, it's like, okay, well, how am I going to expand this? But then after I'd expanded it, I realized, well, you've got the blueprint for the novelization of this. So what would Wesley do? It started off as a short story. I wrote a screenplay, and now I've wrote a novel or novella. It's technically a novella at the moment, but it's 300 words off being a technical novel. So we'll see what that
You could round
we'll,
that
we'll
up.
we'll see what it ends up being.
Yeah.
It's either a long novella or a short novel, depending on what edits are made. But yeah, so I don't, that's not wasted time, because the screenplay that I wrote then provided me with a plan to write a novel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think Adam Neville has been doing a similar thing. He wrote a number of on spec screenplays, and then that has formed the kind of body of the novels that he's put out in recent years. And I think if you're going to do on spec, then that's a good way to do it, because then your time is never wasted.
Yeah.
I just hate the idea of writing stories and then nobody ever gets to see them. And
Mm-hmm.
obviously, when you're at the start of your journey, that happens a
Mm-hmm.
lot. There
Yeah.
are a lot of stories that I've written that nobody's seen, but I guess I'm talking more at a point where you're more established and you're more confident with your voice and what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, even then, there are going to be times where you write something and it's a dud. But I'm trying to maximize my chances of having an audience. So it just feels like a sensible way to buy another ticket for success if I turn the screenplay into a novel. So that's what I'd recommend. If people's primary goal is to have readers and an audience, then you can repurpose, you can adapt what it is you've done in one form into another.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, it's not going to be a straight adaptation. I mean, and when I say me and Bob wrote our, a screenplay for their watching, it's not exact
Mm-hmm.
to the novel. It is like a reimagining. Almost to a point where I've said to Bob, if we wanted, we could write another version of their watching
Yeah.
and release that. But I'm not sure we'll ever do that because it may not be exact, but it is a little bit too similar.
Have you ever had anything optioned so far?
I don't know if I'm allowed to talk about that,
Okay, we'll take
but
that as a
that
maybe.
there have been there have been conversations, and I very much hope that something can happen at some point in the future.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, uh, I also wanted to talk a little bit about the This Is Horror podcast because I started listening to that. Um, I wouldn't say from the beginning. I can't say that, but about a year in. And I
Yeah.
wasn't always listening. There was periods of times where I wasn't listening to podcasts at all, but This Is Horror has been there pretty much for the last 10 years. And congratulations on 11 years, by the way. That's
Thank you.
incredible.
Thank you.
That's a really long time to podcast.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we've seen a lot of podcasts start and a lot of podcasts go in that
Yeah,
time, and
including some of mine. Yeah,
it's true. Yeah, darkness dwells.
yeah.
but yeah, I mean, it's an honor and a privilege to be able to do this and to be able to talk to so many fantastic writers. And I
Mhm,
try not to be complacent, not to take that for granted. I mean, honestly, like, particularly since my divorce, like, my whole kind of ethos has been to never take anyone or anything for granted, because there's no guarantee of permanence. There's no guarantee that
mhm.
anything will be forever. And in some ways that might seem depressing, but I actually think it can be very liberating, and it can make you a better person
Yeah,
if you govern each action with this could be the last time that this happens. And any time I see my daughter, I try and act as if this could be the final time that I
mhm,
see her. And obviously, I hope with all my heart and my being that it isn't. But
yeah,
if I act as if it could be, because every time it could be, it's not just with her; it's with everyone.
yeah. There's a
I,
philosopher. I can't remember who it was, but they said every time you tuck in your child at night, do so as though it's the last time because it could be the last time. And there's some people who take that as being very depressing, but as you said, it's not. It forces you to appreciate each and every moment.
yeah, yeah. I mean, there's things as well along those lines that, like, one day will be the last time that you pick up and comfort your child,
Yeah,
and you'll never know that was the last time. And that kind of sends a chill down my back,
yeah,
but it's true. Like, everything shifts, everything is impermanent. You never step into the same river twice.
very true. Yeah. Um, I want to talk about your guests a little because you've talked to pretty much every single like big author, small author that's out there. Not everyone, of course, but a lot of them. I mean, you've even talked to Dean Koontz like 3 times, I think.
We
So
have,
you
yeah,
said something earlier about just, instead of not doing something and regretting it, just going for it. So
yeah.
is this something that you do in regards to getting guests? Do you just like sneak into their DMs, or do you send cold emails and saying, "Hey," like how did that start?
Well, I certainly wouldn't. I wouldn't use the phrasing "I sneak in." That makes me sound like some sort of
I've
creeper.
I've heard
But
I've heard other people refer to like there's another podcast I was listening to, and they were referring to themselves as saying, I like to sort of slide in to their DMs and say, "Hi, would you like to be on my show?"
I think there are various channels of trying to get a guest, and different people have different ways of going about it.
Hmm.
And for me, I try to do it in the most respectful and the most official route that I can.
Hmm.
So If we're talking about really big name guests, then a good starting point will be like having a look who is their publicist or who is their agent
Hmm.
and reaching out that way. But yeah, I certainly have kind of gone for it, as it were, and I've made those requests of so many people, and like, there's been a number of rejections because I don't mess about. If
Hmm.
there's somebody who I want on the show, then
Yeah.
I'm going to reach out to them. And sometimes they say yes, and I'm chatting to Chuck Palahniuk, and sometimes, it's not possible. And then I'm not talking to Quentin Tarantino, for
Yeah.
example. But, like it's also about looking at the timing as well. And sometimes if you see a release is coming up, that could be a good opportunity. On the other hand, if they haven't released something for a while, that might be a good opportunity too, because
Hmm.
nobody's really requesting
Or
to
thinking
speak to
about
them
them.
at that
Yeah.
point. But certainly in the early years, it was about reaching out to people. Yeah, like there have been times where I've like emailed or DM'd, yeah, especially if we're connected. I don't like the word sneaking because
That
it's
was the wrong word to use,
yeah,
because the quote I was thinking of, they didn't even use the word sneak, they said slide, like, they
yeah.
slide into their DMs like, "Hey."
But like I mean, I'm very polite about it. If I've had no contact with that person, I don't presume that they know anything about this as horror. We
Mhm,
might be quite well known in the horror fiction community, but I am under no illusion that we are big in the grand scheme of things. We are somewhat known in a very specific niche. So if I've
mhm,
not spoken to that person, I'm introducing who we are, what we do, and asking if they're interested.
yeah,
And sometimes they are, and sometimes they're not. But I do think you've got to reach out to people. Do it as officially as possible. So if they've got an email address on their website, that would be great. Often, particularly with a big name author, they've got a number of emails. So it's like if it's a media inquiry, if it's the
mhm,
rights inquiry, so then you can get to the specific person. So I think that's a good first route. And then you could look, is there a way on social media? I mean that they are never obligated to reply to you.
absolutely,
Nobody
yeah,
is obligated to reply to anyone, really. I mean, if I get a cold email, like there's not the onus for me to have to reply to that person. I think this comes back to not taking anyone or anything for granted. A reply is a privilege.
mhm,
And I mean, I don't really advocate. For me personally, I don't like tagging people publicly and asking them, "Will you come on the show?" I don't, to me that it doesn't sit right. That's not the way to do it.
yeah,
For some people, they do. It's like I've always said to people, you've got to do what sits right for you.
mhm.
There's no right and wrong. Like I guess there's a few rights
There
and
could be
wrong,
a
but
few wrong ways, yeah.
generally, it's broad, and it's like, what is your own personal morality? What sits well with you? So,
Mhm,
I mean, putting respect and kindness first is a good starting point, and going from there. Although like I probably have occasionally tagged Stephen King as somebody who I would like to talk to. That is the one exception.
yeah.
So what am I saying here? Don't publicly tag people unless it's King. No, that's a terrible message.
He
I'm
might not.
saying I'm saying sometimes I'm a hypocrite, and we already went
Yeah,
over the fact that we're all flawed. and wanting to talk to Stephen King at some point is my weakness. But I've also reached out officially. I've been rejected in as many ways as you can by Stephen King, and
Yeah,
and I'll continue to
that's
be
too bad.
rejected.
I
But
would love to
he's
see Stephen King come on your show, honestly.
yeah. I mean that is the dream. I have said before I would fly to Maine if that's what like, I'm not messing about. I would
Yeah.
go. I would spend the money to get to Maine to interview him if that's what it took. So he is the number one bucket list, as it were, of people to
If
talk to, as he is for pretty much everyone who has a horror fiction podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to talk to him too, but like you
Yeah.
said, that's what like everyone. But I would love to see him on the This Is Horror podcast, mostly because of your strategy of questioning authors. I would love to see Stephen King go through the ringer, so to speak, of
Yeah.
life lessons, and early beginnings, and what he's learned and all that. That would be a fascinating conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I certainly don't hold back, and I'm not uncomfortable to ask difficult questions
Yeah.
with anyone. Yeah, that there was a turning point, I guess, episode 100 with David Moody, where he really opened up about his mental health and struggles and depression.
Hmm.
And it was from that moment that I thought, yeah, we can go to uncomfortable places. It's about respect. If you're doing it in a respectful way, if you're doing it with kindness,
Hmm.
also it's like, look, if you don't want to talk about this,
Just
we
move
don't
on. Yeah.
have to, but ask
Exactly.
the
Yeah.
question, see what happens. And I think that's where a lot of these interesting conversations come from. Not just from going to pain points, but following the curiosity and asking the things that perhaps other people wouldn't.
Hmm. One thing I'm curious about is your conversations with Dean Koontz, because I have to wonder, did that raise your anxiety at all when this happened? Like the first time, do you get nervous before talking to authors, especially big ones like Dean Koontz?
I think to begin with, certainly in the earlier days of This Is Horror, I got more anxious or more nervous. I think when something is very important to me, I don't know if anxious or nervous is too strong a word, but there will be an awareness. So
Hmm.
I try to prepare meticulously, but I went even further for Chuck Palahniuk
Oh
because
yeah.
that meant a lot to me. Um, to be honest, I always have far more material that I could talk about than we often do
Hmm.
because I would hate to be caught in a situation where it's like, right, well, I'm all out of questions. I'm never all out of questions. There's always somewhere we could go.
Yeah.
I think with Chuck and I think with Dean Koontz, again, particularly the first time, and that's the same with Joe Lansdale. There's an awareness that this is an important conversation. There's an awareness as well that there will be a listenership or a viewership that is beyond my regular viewership. So I want to make this one count
Yeah.
because I'm so aware that for a number of people, this is their first, possibly only time, if depending on how it goes,
Yeah.
listening to This Is Horror. So it needs to count. So it's an awareness of the weight of the situation rather than an anxiety or nervousness, which some people would probably say, well, we define that as anxious or nervous, and then okay, well, that's
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, there's levels to these things, but I think as well, like I said, I try not to be complacent.
Hmm.
So everything I try to prepare for with respect, and like for me, there are certainly conversations that I think have gone better than others. I'm always trying to make it a good conversation, and I think that's my job. It's always on me. It's not on the guest.
Yeah.
because everyone has something that they're curious about and that they want to talk about. I have to pull that out of them and to get that information
Yeah.
from them.
I
I
know what
mean,
you mean.
yeah, yeah, I can tell you now if if I get the opportunity to talk to Stephen King, there will be so much prep that will go into that. It will be,
You're gonna get lost.
yeah, yeah. As long as you have the next question planned, then you don't get, yeah, you don't get lost. You just got to be one step ahead,
Yeah.
know where that next turn is, and you'll be okay. But obviously, like an important part of the conversation, because I think it is, I like to approach it more as a conversation rather than an interview. Is you've got to be a good listener as well.
Yeah.
So often the conversation will go somewhere unexpected, somewhere that was not planned for,
Mhm.
because I'm responding to what it is the guest said, and I'm following up on that a lot more. Whereas I think to start with, it might be like, right, I've got my questions, we're going to go through them. It's like, no, listen to what they're saying,
Yeah, yeah.
respond to that, go where they're kind of guiding you if you listen carefully enough.
Mhm. Yeah, like, I come up with a whole bunch like, I was telling you this before we started, I always come up with, like, a list of questions, but I don't really call them questions, they're more like a map of, all the things I wanna know, you know what I mean? Like, all my
Yeah.
curiosity points, and, sometimes it's hard to get to those questions, and sometimes I have to skip questions because, the conversation always goes somewhere else.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is really cool, and, it's one reason why I keep doing it, myself, because I love talking to people like yourself, and, it's an adventure on its own.
Yeah.
I always, like, find it funny before I started podcasting and people who are like, "Oh, I'd love to start a podcast," I always wanna warn them and to warn my old self, like, "Watch out because it will hijack your life."
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's an awful lot of time investment in it. And I
Yeah.
think, well, particularly if you want to do it well, I mean, if people want to start a podcast, then they should, but think
Yeah,
about what is
absolutely.
it that you want to do? What is it that you want to achieve? And just like with my story writing, have some sort of plan towards that. You know,
Mhm.
prep is key.
Yeah, prep is very important, and when I
Yeah.
started, that was one of my biggest mistakes, I didn't prep very well at all, but now I do, like, as much prep as I can.
Yeah.
Alright.
And don't be afraid to experiment as well. I mean, we've done different formats of This Is Horror shows. I mean, of course, we're very well known for the long form conversation. That's what I think is most interesting for me and where we excel. But we've also, early days we did some book reviews. We occasionally do, particularly for Patreon, Story Unboxed, where rather than review, we analyze the story, look at what are some craft lessons, look at how the story has been constructed. There are other podcasts that will do something more thematic, maybe akin to a convention, a horror con kind of round table. So let's talk about folk horror, something like that.
Mhm.
We've done episodes where we've had multiple guests, but actually it's kind of like a patchwork podcast because they're not all there at the same time, but they're all talking on the same topic, and then I've put those together.
Yeah.
So really, it's about finding what it is that you enjoy and what it is that you think is going to provide most value for your listenership. Yeah, don't be afraid to experiment. Even if, like us, we're coming up to 600 episodes. If I decide I want to throw an experimental one in to see how it goes, then do. I think, like I alluded to earlier, not being complacent has probably been the key to our longevity.
Yeah.
and never assuming, like, whatever success you enjoy, don't assume that that will be forever.
No,
We've been over this. Nothing
nothing's
is
permanent.
forever.
Yeah.
And if some people consider us to be amongst the best horror fiction interview podcasts, then obviously that's a massive honor, but it's never a right. So if you want to continue to have that reputation, then you're going to have to continue to bring it. Especially, today there's so many people having these conversations, so many people doing it very, very well.
Hmm.
So you got to bring
Absolutely.
your A game.
Yeah. All right. I have two more questions, and then
Okay.
I'll let you off the hook. uh,
Okay.
First question is: I'm pretty sure that you are coming out with a new book this year called Daddy's Boy.
Oh, Daddy's Boy.
Is that coming out this year?
So Daddy's Boy at the moment, so it's been through beta readers. It is with my film manager, and we are looking at what the options are. So it is very likely that Daddy's Boy will be the next book that I will put out. There is no confirmed date yet, but I think to guess either this year or next year is a good guess. We're just looking at the options right now. Yeah.
Excellent. I can't wait. Um, I love reading what you've written. I also read the girl in the video. I decided to skip talking about that because there's so many other things that are more recent that I wanted to talk to you about. Um, so, last question, and this is something I'm going to start asking everyone at the end of my podcasts, since everyone seems to have this type of thing going. So, the question is, what author do you think is underrated and more people need to be talking about?
Oh, well, I mean, unfortunately, there's so many
Hmm.
authors who are underrated and more people need to be talking about. I mean, as a very kind of niche, as somebody into kind of Japanese dark fiction, I think Ryu Murakami, who wrote Audition and
Okay.
Pierced and Coin Locker Babies and In the Miso Soup, he's known, but he's not as well known as I think he should be. Haruki Murakami, who is also fantastic, is much greater, in terms of popularity. So I think more people should check out Ryu Murakami. And if they were to do that, then I think In the Miso Soup is a good starting point. I think as well, I mean, as somebody who likes dark fiction with a comic air, John Niven. Now he sells a decent amount of books, but I think particularly when we're talking to the horror fiction crowd, particularly an American and a Canadian audience, not a lot of people are going to be familiar with John Niven.
Hmm.
So he could be one to check out too. And then I also think from the UK, Matt Wesolowski,
Hmm.
who the audio versions are fantastic too.
Oh yeah.
I'm not even sure how do we describe what it is he's doing, because he does things in a podcast format, but it's the written word, but it means that, like, it's kind of like investigating a crime or something very dark. There's often elements of the occult. So those are people who I think your audience in particular should check out, particularly if
Awesome.
they like the kind of things that I'm doing. I know that it would have been maybe easier or more predictable to take some people within the horror fiction community and people who are on social media and pinpoint them, but it's almost an impossible task. And I actually think in naming the authors that I have, that I'm probably introducing, new names that your listeners and viewers haven't heard of before.
Yeah, I haven't heard of the third one. Um,
Matt Wesolowski.
yeah,
Yeah.
when you said that, I was like, oh, okay, I haven't heard of him.
Yeah.
I'm definitely
So
gonna check him out. Yeah.
yeah, so even though it is pronounced Wesolowski, in terms of the spelling, it would be like Wesolowski. He's most famous for six stories, but he's also done Beast and Deity and Demon and Hydra. So that's enough information for people to be able to Google and
Yeah.
find the author that I'm talking about, Matt Wesolowski, Wesolowski.
Awesome. Okay, I got it. All right, so I want to thank you for coming on the show because I kind of snuck into. Well, actually, you asked me over on TikTok if I would read your book and review it, and then I sort of snuck in and said, "Hey, you want to come on my show too?" So
Well,
I want to thank you for saying yes and seemingly being eager to do so.
yeah, there was no sneaking as far as I understand from either of us, but I believe I saw you were on TikTok, and it's like, wait a minute, Jason is on TikTok, and I particularly remembered how generous and in depth and considered your review of the girl in the video was, and I thought,
Hmm.
well, yeah, I'd love it if you could check out House of Bad Memories. So
Yeah,
yeah.
because you did send me an e-copy of the girl in the video way back when it was released, and I read it and reviewed it, and I'm glad that you enjoyed the review. I really enjoyed that one too. It was a good book. Very, it made me a little paranoid, honestly, to be
Yeah,
online.
yeah, well, I mean, it had its intended effect amongst other things. I mean, I
Yeah.
think we should be careful as to what we
Oh,
do
for
and what
sure.
we
Yeah.
don't put
And that book.
online. And like I again, to go back kind of post my divorce or post my breakup with my ex-wife, I'm way more private about my personal life since then. I don't know. Yeah, I felt very kind of vulnerable and just like I don't want to share so much as to what's private, have that
Yeah.
separation between work and privacy. But rather than end on that dark note, I mean, you mentioned Daddy's Boy before, which is forthcoming. I'm very excited to see how people react to that because I think, like with my writing, I kind of see like the girl in the video and they're watching as representing one phase, and then House of Bad Memories and Daddy's Boy as another. Now, I would argue that like well, each release, apart from their watching, gets less horror-y. They're all dark fiction, but I think whereas House of Bad Memories was dark fiction with comedy, there's an argument that Daddy's Boy is comedy with dark fiction. So it'll be interesting to see how people respond to that.
Yeah. All right. So I'm gonna put an end to this. I want to thank you again. I want to thank everyone who showed up and watched, and everyone who comes in the future. And you can look for this on the podcast in about a week. So thank you, Michael.
Okay. Thank you to everyone for listening. Take care of yourselves. Be good to one another. Read horror. Keep on writing and have a great, great day.